Now you're ready to tackle the helicopter dust. But before we begin, let's take a look at the final result that we want to achieve. We want to have some downwash dust that happens because the helicopter's rotors are rotating and creating a wind force pushing downwards. Let's look at a few references. On our references, we can estimate what is the area underneath the helicopter that needs to be producing the downwash, what is the height of the dust that usually happens from this kind of helicopters, how fast it is moving. Let's take a good look at it and analyze it. Let's see what kind of breakup we have on this dust, the density, all of those aspects while looking at different references. And as you're working step by step, you're coming back to your references, checking, am I on the right track or not? So to have the effect that you're seeing right now on the screen, we need to start with some good sourcing. And the sourcing is going to look like this. If you look at the source, it is a little point scattered straight underneath the helicopter that is actually attached to the location of the rotors because they are the ones that are creating the force. And this source looks like it has a little bit of noise and looks like circles are moving very fast outwards from a central location. And this what will help us to create some natural look of dust being pushed really, really quickly outwards. And we will create some custom velocities here to make it look like it's moving in a direction of the helicopter. So let's start with a simple sphere. The sphere will be 6 by 6 meters. So this is around the area that we want to count as a source under the helicopter. And first thing we will do, we'll create some color on it, stripes. And if I play, you will see that those stripes are actually moving quite fast outwards from the center. You can see here I wrote some explanations of what is happening in this code. I'm not going to go too much into the details. This is one of the examples you can find on JoyFX, everyone's favorite place to go for all things Houdini knowledge. As we all know, always thank you, Matt, for all the knowledge that you're sharing. And this is a little setup that you can find much deeper explanation for in there. But what it basically is doing, we are creating a color that is based on the distance from the center of the sphere to where the point is located. We're creating a little bit of a gradient, and then we are using a sin function to create waves. And then we are adding some frequency here to adjust how often those waves need to happen. And we are animating it by adding a $T with a multiplier here in the center parameter. So that's what you have right now, just some color that travels outwards. After that, as we saw earlier on our source, we need some deformation in our source. We don't want it to be just straight circles, so we are adding simple 2 mountain nodes with some animation. That's what you have. And after that, what I'm doing is actually I need to keep only the top part of it. The bottom part I don't really need, and the reason for that is just the amount of points that I'm going to be scattering. I did some experiments, and after some trial and error, I realized that just the top half of the sphere with points scattered on it for density, this is good enough for us. We don't need the bottom part. After that, I'm scattering points on this geometry using the color attribute as density. So we have where the points, where the color was dark, then we have less points. And after that, I'm just stating that the position in Y should be 0, so I'm flattening everything. Now it's a flat thing. And if I play, it's a little bit slow to play in the viewport, but what's happening, you can see now those white circles, a little bit deformed, moving outwards, and it's all points, which will make it easier for us to turn into volume sourcing later for our Pyro simulation. And what I'm doing is I'm just turning this color into density. So brighter color, whiter areas, higher the density. Also, one thing that we looked at our references, what happens is, yes, there's more dust that is kicked up from the very center, and as it goes outwards, less and less dust is being picked up. This kind of a gradient. Normally, that's what we usually do with our sources, right? We rarely give it just uniform density. Very often when you have a source at the edges, you want the density to fade off. You want it to become less. And there are many ways how you can achieve that. You can just create a point somewhere in the center, and from this point you can create the distance to this point and just do a ramp from the center. What I did here is created a circle. I extracted the centroid from the circle. You can, in the same way, just add a point here somewhere. This is your point in the center. You will get exactly the same result. That was, I was doing it with a circle because I was experimenting of giving this gradient not straight from the center, but somewhere else in the world. But the result is going to be the same. And then I'm calculating the distance from the center using distance from geometry. You could do it with one line of vex in an attribute wrangle, but I wanted to show another way how you can do it if you prefer to do it with nodes. So we have this mask attribute that is from 0, from the center of the world outwards, moving outwards, and then we are adjusting our density by the mask, which means we still have the density variation by color, plus when it's closer to the center, the density is higher. After that, here comes the interesting part. We need to create our interesting custom velocities. So let me move a little bit on the right and show you what is happening here. Let me just zoom out. We have our helicopter coming in. Up to a particular frame before our explosion starts, this is our animated geometry, and then we are switching it to our result of our RBD sim, so that we always have our rotors here. After we have the rotors, let's isolate them, because remember, they are the ones that are creating the downward wind force, and we're extracting the centroid from those rotors. Then I am extracting the ground from our buildings, and I'm raying the point from the rotors onto the ground, because I want the downwash source to be straight under the rotors. So just raying it with by minimal distance downwards. After that, I'm using trail. Let me just turn on my velocity to compute the velocity attribute so that I have the record on in which direction the helicopter is moving, because when downward helicopter dust is happening, I want to take into account not only the dust that happens outwards from the downwash, but also the directionality of it. So remember that on this point we have velocity attribute that stores the direction of the movement of the helicopter. Then what we are going to do is we are going to create our custom velocity on this guy, on our source, which will be velocities traveling outwards from the center, and we're going to combine it with this directional velocity. And we do it here in this create v attribute wrangle. So here first, I'm just storing this normalized p into velocity, and I'm creating a new attribute called test just to show you how it looks. So when we use normalized p into our velocity, what we get is velocity from the center of the world outward, or from the center outwards onto the point. We start from here. Yeah, that's already a good starting point, because that's how we want the dust to be moving. After that, we have our forward vector, and that's the one that captures the direction, this guy, the trail that we calculated earlier of the point underneath the helicopter. I'm adding a little bit of, let me just show it to you. This is my forward movement. I'm adding a little bit of bias upwards. You can see here in my vex code, I'm adding one in y, so that this directional movement is not completely flat on the ground. I'm adding it a little bit upwards. And again, that was trial and error. And at some point I saw that my dust was just too much to the ground and too much pushed in one direction. So I added it a little bit more upwards force. That's what we are up to here right now. After that, what we are doing is we are combining both by using mix, and this mix is our custom parameter here that is combined with the distance from the center. And the result in the end will look like this. So you can see it's a little bit skewed, so we still have some directionality in it, but we also have it pretty flat in the center and more going upwards out on the edges. That's what we want. Okay, in the end, so you get this nice something that looks like maybe a soup bowl, and this velocity worked perfectly for our purposes. So here is our create V. If you want dig into this node, there are some good annotations here. You can look through it on your own. And the usual, I really like to add a little bit of velocity. Let me just connect it here. A little bit of noise. So if I bypass it, we just have a little bit of noise, and I'm adjusting, you can see, on the length of the noise. So in some areas, the velocity is going to be higher and pushing the dust some more. After that, what we are doing is we are copying our source onto the point that we created, the point that was right straight underneath the rotors. One important thing is to untick this attribute from target. We do not want to copy our V attribute from target because we already created our custom velocity. Because if you look here, let me just move this visualize. Let me put it under my copy. Let's see how it looks. If I tick it, what's going to happen is just going to inherit my directional velocity, and all the work that we've done is going to be wasted. That's not what we want, right? So we untick that. And after that, we just cache it. We cache the source. I'm caching it from 1270 to all the way to the end. Because remember, the downwash happens from the very beginning of the shot as the helicopter enters the frame. After you cached our helidust source points, let's take a look of what we have. I'm visualizing right now my density. Turn on the density visualizer here. If this is not working for you, remember that happens to me sometimes. The visualizer icon here might be off, then you won't see any of the visualizers. But if we scroll through the timeline, what we see is here our source is moving towards our camera, and then at some point, I remember we're caching it all the way to till the end, but we're not going to be sourcing from it all the way to till the end. So we have our source, everything is working. Then we are using our volume rasterize attribute. What we need is density and velocity. And you saw me earlier when in other setups for the shot, I created p-scale attribute separately and then used it here at a scale of 1 because it was set earlier. In this case, I am just changing the p-scale here straight in volume rasterize attributes. Both ways are completely valid. It's whatever you are more comfortable with. I wanted to show you both ways because sometimes you open someone else's setup and one way it's there, one way it's here. Just get familiar with it done both ways. Here on the left, you can see I have a blast node where I'm removing my velocity to show you just the density. And you will notice that when I rasterize my volumes, for example, in this case, the velocity blur is applied. Let's compare the difference. The difference is minimal, but sometimes it is noticeable. In the sourcing, sometimes it can help you get rid of some artifacts where you don't have enough distance, for example, between the points. If something is moving very fast, this velocity blur helps with that and makes your source look more natural. Let me go back to view the source through the camera. And let's see what we have here in our Pyro Solver. We obviously need some colliders, and in this case, what we have is just our buildings. And remember our wonderful model of a car that we created earlier, and these are just volume colliders for the buildings. Let me take a look at the information. All we have is one collision volume. In theory, I could have used the volumes from the explosion of the helicopter. In your shot, if you're making some adjustments, you might need to use that if in your case, for example, pieces are falling straight into the dust and it's really affecting it. In my case, they're not. And I know this is just going to slow down my computation quite a bit, but the results are really not noticeable. And again, that was trial and error. I tried it with this collision, I tried it without, and noticed that there is visually not really much difference, but the computation is much faster because I need to compute less collisions. Let me go into manual no mode and let's see what we have in our Pyro Solver. Let's start with from the beginning. Again, the usual voxel size is connected to our volume rasterize attributes. Max substeps are at 4. Here I needed to crank them up a little higher than, for example, in our smoke from the flying pieces, just because we have really fast moving volume here, and we don't want to have some sloppy look on it when it moves too fast. Sometimes you will have a blobby look, sometimes you don't have too much of a breakup on the edges. Increasing those substeps really helps here. And you will notice that timescale is set to 1.5. And again, that was some experiments that I was doing back and forth. And in the end, I wanted this ground volume to move quite fast because I want to add some dynamic feeling to the shot. Something is about to happen. The helicopter is coming. A lot of dust is being created around. And in the end, using 1.5 timescale, speeding up this action really helped achieve the look that I wanted. But this is a very subjective decision. Again, this is not a rule written somewhere. It is something for you to experiment with and for you to try and find what you like more. In the collisions, the usual, this is our SDF volume plus velocity. In this case, our collisions have no velocity, so it's just the collision volume that is going to be read in. And of course, we need the ground. Our ground is at 0, so this is easy, closing below 0, everything here. What we are sourcing is we're sourcing density, and here we have a ramp of how everything is going to be sourced, and you can see I'm actually referencing the start frame from the bullet solver. That's our RBD simulation. So the moment the RBD sim starts, and for first 10 frames, the density is at scale of 3, so it's really thick density. All the way as the helicopter travels, comes in before the explosion in first 10 frames, while it's still in the air and the rotors are still rotating quite fast. We have full-on density sourcing. And then 30 frames after that, it will die all the way to 0. Because if you look at our final result, in the end, you can see that this heli dust dies off because the rotors are falling on the ground, they are slowing, and they're not creating any more downwash. And we are sourcing velocity in a similar manner. We are ramping it. We are ramping it for the first 10 frames, it's at full scale. And then by the end of the shot, it goes to 0.1. You will notice that these are the main two forces that I'm using it. I'm not using any rotor force after the explosion because, again, I tried, I did experiments, and in the end it did not have much effect on this pass because it's quite widespread outside the helicopter. After the sourcing, let's take a look at our fields tab. And here we just changed our dissipation to be at 0.01. Let's scroll down, nothing else really has been changed here. The most interesting part here is our shape tab, in which we are using the new feature from Houdini 20 that is called Density Influences Gravity. And what it does is the heavier areas that have higher density will be influenced by gravity more, and that's what usually happens with dust. And this is exactly what we're simulating here, so this is the perfect feature for this case. You can see I'm using it at half the scale, and that works perfectly for me. I did, again, experiments starting from 0 to all the way 1, and 0.5 ended up being the value that I preferred. You can see right now on the screen a comparison, the same simulation with this feature off, where we have the default behavior of the dust, and on the other side of the screen you can see the feature applied, and you can see how much nicer our dust looks when it settles down after some time. It looks much more natural. It really looks like some heavy particles from the ground were lifted and then they're naturally going downwards. Let's scroll a little bit down. We have some more our usual controls for the dust, like disturbance, that is controlled by the speed field. We went through that before, so I'm not going to go into more detail. And we have our usual turbulence. And here you will notice that I'm using turbulence at quite a high value. Normally I tend to use turbulence more like just a weak wind. And normally it's like 0.05 or values like this. But in this case, because everything is moving around, everything is super fast, the velocity of the sourcing is already very fast. So everything is just really, really dynamic in the shot. So I really want to keep that feeling and have the atmosphere that there is wind from the rotors, there is effect of the explosion when everything is coming towards the camera, there is a lot of movement happening on the ground. That's why I'm keeping this turbulence quite high. And then our usual, if we go to the output, here we are outputting just the density and just the velocity, and we are resampling the velocity, 16-bit float, VDB, your usual workflow. And after that, we are caching it. After you're done caching, the last node that was added here is this VDB clip. Let me just turn on my live view, and you can see the boundaries of the VDB clip I'm keeping actually quite large. It's 15 meters of padding on both sides, and the reason for that is normally with a volume you don't want to clip it too much, because if you start lighting it and you have maybe a strong light source close to the volume, if it is clipped too close to the camera edge, you will have glowing edges, and we want to avoid that. We still want to have some enough volume to simulate realistic penetration of the light into a volume. So that's why I'm giving it quite large padding. I added a little trick to optimize the simulation for you, because in the end this sim is actually getting really, really big, and we are keeping it not too low res, so on some machines it might be a problem. So I'm adding a little trick inside this Pyro Solver that might help you. Please note my Houdini is on a manual mode, I'm not computing anything, and I'm going to dive into the Pyro Solver and show you what I have here. First, on the right side, this is some usual gas turbulence. I'm just adding a little bit of extra wind here. You can disregard that. This is something you're already familiar with. This is the node that we are interested in. Here, gas field wrangle with clip density. So this is a little of a hack. It's not something you often do in simulations. But in this case, because I know that some of you might have issues with your machines computing this massive simulation, because it really takes a lot of space on disk, and you need quite a good machine to do that. What we will do is, we know that in this shot the camera movement is quite subtle after the helicopter comes towards the frame, so we can safely remove some parts of the simulation, and don't worry about that. So here what I'm doing is very, very simple. I'm just saying when the voxels reach particular boundaries, set density to 0. And let me show you in the end how it looks. Let me go to the auto update mode, and if I move a little bit outwards, you see my density is actually clipped here. You see those edges? Normally, if we look at our boundaries, the only collisions that we had is the ground and those buildings. But if you look at my result, I actually here have on the back side and on this side, I have this density clipping. We can go a little bit forward and we see how it looks in the end. Let me just turn off our grid to see it better, and you can see the edges of the clipping. They are way beyond our camera frustum, so they don't bother us. But every time we do that, we're clipping those areas. We are reducing the area, the size that Houdini needs to compute. So here is a little hack for you. If your machine starts struggling with the sim, you can turn it on, or just know that it's inside of your Pyro Solver. And then let's go and jump in our lobs and see how it looks in the render. We are back in lobs, and we are in the section lob test 009. That's where we're gonna test our heli dust. Let's jump in there. Let's view our merge. Let's allow everything to load. Let's view everything through the camera, and we can see it's really blown out right now. Let me just turn off my lighting here, and we can see the dust coming through. We can see the helicopter and the buildings coming through. So at least all the elements are working. As before, what I'm doing here in render geometry settings, on the helicopter I'm saying no motion blur. That's something we did before. The main thing here, if you dive into the material library, 2 more materials were created, smoke light and smoke dense. We'll use them later for our other dust that we're creating on the building. This is something you can experiment with and see what kind of look of those 2 dusts you like more. But here I have now 2 new materials. You can dive in and see it's actually very, very basic pyro shader with just some color and density scale. This one has a smoke brightness in 0.4, and this one has the smoke brightness in 1. That's not much more difference between them. So after that, let's take a look at our assigned materials and let's view it through Karma XPU. And you see right away we have our dust coming through. I really like how our sourcing here looks. We see our waves, the noisy waves of the sourcing, and I like how it goes up in the air.